Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
Good.
Excellent. Thanks for coming on, Andrew. I am Will Wilkinson of the Cato Institute, located in beautiful Iowa City, Iowa. The Cato Institute isn't in, just I am. And you are, why don't you introduce yourself, Andrew?
I'm Andrew Gelman, and I'm located in beautiful New York City, and I teach statistics and political science at Columbia University.
Excellent. And Andrew is the author, one of several authors of what I've found to be the most interesting book on politics in the last year, called, what does it start with, Red or Rich?
Red state, blue state, rich state, poor state, why Americans vote the way they do.
Thank you. I would hold up my copy to the camera to let people see it, but I seem to have misplaced it.
Okay, I'm holding out my copy in front of my face here.
Excellent. Andrew and I did a book forum at the Cato Institute back in October on Rich State, Poor State, and it aired on C-SPAN, so people can go look, rifle through the C-SPAN archives to find the discussion there. But I wanted to chat with you a little, Andrew, about your book, and then talk about how the sort of analytical structure that you lay out in the book has played out in the latest election.
Okay.
So, the theme of the book is that the categories of red states and blue states, that there's this big categorical divide between sort of latte sipping elites and sort of Walmart shopping evangelicals, that's a little bit misleading, and the distinctions are a little bit finer than that. So can you tell us briefly what the big idea of the book is?
Well, one way of introducing is to talk about political polarization and to say that as the election was coming up, you could say that some Americans were viewing this as a transformative election where viewing the Democrats as a sort of traditional party that was going to go back to the old liberal nostrums that don't work, and the Republicans supporting free enterprise and a strong nation. That's one approach. And the other side would be somebody saying, well, the Democrats are doing something new and the Republicans are more of the same, right? So there's a polarization, and one of the things that strikes people is how hard it is for people on the other side to even communicate on the other side. So if you're coming at it by thinking that the Democrats are just pulling stuff out of the Jimmy Carter playbook, it's really hard for you to understand how people could think that Obama's offering something new. And conversely, if you're coming at it from the more liberal perspective, then it's very hard for you to see what Republicans have to say about traditional values at all. I mean, what's traditional about torture, right, and all that. Right. So you get very impassioned views, and that's political polarization. On the other hand, you get another form of polarization when people talk about the two Americas. So the idea, as the late John Edwards said, when you have
Edwards.
Well, the politically late John Edwards said, if you have half of America is basically doing okay, maybe not happy about the stock market, but ultimately has health care, has a little bit of money in the bank, and the other half are people who have to really always look towards next week's paycheck, then they're going to have completely different views about the country and about politics. And one thing that's striking is that first view of polarization has so little to do with the second view of polarization.
Yeah.
And the thing that we grabbed onto, really, we're sort of latching on like a bulldog to something that the media had been talking about since 2000, this idea of rich America, more urban, cosmopolitan, Europeanized America being more democratic, and lower income America, the South and the Plain States being more Republican, and how that seemed wrong. Like, how could that be, given it doesn't seem to fit the traditional two Americas story of polarization?
So, so there's been So ever since the 2000 election, that was the idea that you know, like if you, what was that famous David Brooks column where he like travels from his home in Chevy Chase, wherever he lives, to rural Pennsylvania. It's just like two whole different countries.
Right, it's two whole different countries, and it goes the wrong way because the rich country is full of Democrats and the poor country is full of Republicans. And and so one thing we found was that, well, this is true. It's not just an illusion of the map, but it's relatively recent. That 30 years ago, rich areas were not more Democratic than poor areas. I mean, and so there have been changes. California, for example, California, New Jersey, and Connecticut used to all be solid Republican states, and now they're all solid Democratic states, and they're all relatively rich places.
So, so part of the story is there's been a divergence among wealthier voters in their voting pattern. So it's not the case. One thing that your book shows very, very clearly is that poorer voters are just far more likely to support Democratic candidates than wealthier voters are. So it's not true that there's just this huge mass of poor Americans, you know, sort of bitterly clutching to their, you know, God and guns and whatever they cling to. That poor voters are reliable Democrats by and large, but among the wealthy, there's this divergence. And so wealthy voters in poor states, those are conservative stalwarts.
Yeah, that the red-blue divide is really most pronounced among upper middle class and richer voters. That you do see that there are lower income voters in red states and blue states aren't that different from each other. But lower income voters in places like New York and California, upper income voters in places like New York and California are much more liberal, both economically and socially, than upper income voters in places like Texas and Mississippi. And so, in fact, in some way, I think one reason why a lot of journalists and academics have noticed the red-blue divide is because it actually occurs more among people like us, who are more ideological and maybe have more time to think about things like this.
Yeah, it's a split among the upper middle classes and the lower upper classes. So poor people in Mississippi and poor people in New York City have similar voting patterns. Rich people in Mississippi and rich people in New York City are worlds apart from one another. So what explains?
Well, that's pretty true. Although I think you've overstated it a little, because New York City in particular is pretty liberal, and I think the poor people in New York City are going to be. I think yes. I think that actually
the most polarizing example.
Right. It's not that poor people vote the same in every state. There are definitely low income people in Idaho are quite conservative, for example. But that the red blue divide, the divide between rich and poor states or Democratic and Republican states is not so strong among lower income people. So you can't if you're talking about rich people, you can predict their attitudes quite a bit by just how rich their state is. If you talk about poor people, the state income is not a particularly good predictor. The states vary, but not in that same systematic way.
Right. So if your state is richer, then you're more like. If your state is a rich state and you're a rich person, you're more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. Is that right? Yeah.
I have to reassure any viewers out there that it's all very clear in the book. And that's one reason we have so many graphs, is because it does get to be a tongue twister when you describe it.
Yeah.
But I think
one of the graphs that I loved was showing that if poor people were a country, right? What would be who would get what percentage of the vote? And if sort of rich people were a country, who would get what percentage? And that was kind of illuminating to see how the relative uniform, and the difficulty here is that everything's relative to everything else. That you're talking about, it's not that there are any uniform blocks, right? I mean, like as you were saying, poor voters in Idaho tend to be fairly conservative. So these are generalizations, but if poor America is if only people with an income in the lowest quintile of income distribution were voting, Democrats would win a landslide. Right?
Yeah, well, exactly. It wouldn't be close, and in fact, the difference between how rich and poor vote nowadays in recent elections is about the same as it was around in the 1940s. It's not. So I think there's two stories that I know you will. You like when people have like fixed ideas that are wrong. So let me tell you two fixed ideas that I hear out there.
Okay.
So one idea that is wrong is that there's all this inequality all of a sudden, and so now there's so much inequality that this shows up in voting, and so now you see the rich and the poor voting so differently from each other, and that's because of the two Americas. And well, there is a lot of inequality, especially as you know, especially because the super rich have become so rich. Maybe they lost a little in the past few months.
Yeah.
But actually, rich and poor vote no more differently now than they did 60 years ago. So there are some graphs where you see the widening gap between how rich and poor vote, where around in the 50s the gap was about zero, and it gradually increased through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it's this huge gap now. It's been pretty steady in the 2000s. I will talk about 2008 in a bit. But that graph, if you start in the 50s, it looks extremely dramatic. If you start in the 40s, what you see is that there was class-based voting in the 40s. It went down in the 50s and 60s when, as we talked about, when both the Democrats and Republicans had more centrist economic policies. And then starting with Goldwater in the 60s, it started dividing again as the parties have moved apart. So rather than saying there's this huge increase in class-based voting, I'd rather say we've returned to the sort of New Deal, post-New Deal era of class-based voting. So that's one thing I think people get wrong, is they start the time series in 1950. The other thing I think people get wrong is there's this idea that there was a golden age of class-based voting, that back in the 1940s when the Democrats are winning everything, so the story goes, everything was fine because there were more poor people than rich people, and they were voting for Democrats. And then something happened, whether it be with Kansas or something else, and somehow, the class-based voting disappeared, and why is that? And there's a lot of concern about that. And no, that's not true. That the 1940s and 30s were not a golden age of class-based voting. Back in that time, there were a lot of low-income Americans who voted Republican, and a lot of higher upper-middle-class Americans who voted Democratic. And in fact, we know that by looking at the red-blue map from the 30s. I mean, there were a lot of farmers, a lot of people in small towns who didn't have high incomes who were conservative Republicans back then. But people have this. I think sometimes people they don't look at the numbers going back in time, and so it gives them people. I sometimes even seem to oscillate between these two views. Anyway, end of rant.
Well, that points to, I think, something incredibly important, is that a lot of people have this, and a lot of times people apply the principle asymmetrically, which is unfair. The idea that that people other than me vote on the base of their sort of economic interests. I vote on the basis of my conception of justice and my sense of fairness, but I'm expecting rich people to vote to sort of protect their advantages. I'm expecting poor people to vote to sort of maximize their transfers and to maximize the sort of social insurance state so that their risks are minimized. But for me, I'm just going to vote for justice.
Oh, it's simpler than that even. I vote for deep reasons having to do with what I think is good for the country, and other people vote based on demographics. I mean, not even interest. They're like, oh yeah, well that's the way they vote. They're Catholic, so they vote blah blah blah. I think, unfortunately, P.J. O'Rourke hasn't read my book. I'm a big P.J. O'Rourke fan from way back, but he said that observant Catholics outside of Massachusetts don't vote Democratic, but in fact, observant Catholics are slightly more Republican than non-observant Catholics, but not by very much. Unfortunately for PJ, about 50% of Catholics vote each way, at least in 2004. But just more generally, he was joking, of course. But like people like me are the worst offenders in that we do tend to try to explain people's votes based on demographics, even though I would never describe my own vote based on demographics, except jokingly.
Mm-hmm.
That would never be a serious view. I'd like to say, in defense of social scientists, we always do recognize that there are these intermediate steps, that my demographics predict my attitudes, and then my attitudes are changing my votes. Mm-hmm. But exactly, a lot of low-income people are economically conservative. A lot of high-income people are economically liberal. There is some truth to this self-interest argument, and the truth is, I think that suppose that you say, well, you might be high income, but you might be economically liberal because you believe in arguments of fairness and so forth. If that's true, you'd probably believe that even more if you were low income, because then you not only get to believe it, but you also get to get the stuff. And conversely,
go ahead.
I mean, if you're a low income, suppose you're low income economic conservative because you think that in the long run that a capitalist system is going to make everybody richer, that's fine, but you're probably even more likely to believe that if you're already doing well.
That's right.
You have that extra personal reason for believing it.
Yeah, the phenomenon that social psychologists like to call motivated cognition. So there's a fine distinction between saying that people people's ideology reflects their class interest, and that it may do so indirectly through sort of a bunch of convoluted sort of cultural mores, but I just don't think, as you're pointing out, that the evidence just doesn't bear out the fact that there are these really strong, consistent relationship between people's sort of economic status and their policy preferences.
People have big problems with relationships that are not zero but not deterministic.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, it is.
Statistics are counterintuitive, and that's one of the reasons I think people ought to learn them earlier, is that these arguments would be more easily resolved if you could just go to the data. I do want to return to this point about inequality in voting, because it is one of my bugbears, so I'll ride my hobby horse for a second. Which is that reading this whole, I think there's basically the whole genre of books that was coming out at the sort of last half of the Bush administration from Democratic political analysts about inequality. Whether or not inequality changes much, I think we'll stop hearing the same arguments now that we're going to have a Democratic administration and Democratic congressional majorities. But all of these books seem to share a narrative which I've come to call the inequality road to serfdom argument, as an homage to Friedrich Hayek's road to serfdom argument. So Hayek's argument was that even just a little bit of central economic planning puts us on a slippery slope to a complete command and control economy, which then leads to a kind of sort of dictatorship, right? So you start out small.
Because people like it so much.
Yeah, because people like it so much.
They're addicted to going healthcare and stuff like that, right? Although that was before healthcare was in there. So tell me your inequality road to serfdom.
The inequality road to serfdom argument, which you can find in Paul Krugman's work, it's in Jonathan Chait's book, it's in Larry Bartel's recent book. It actually runs through most of liberal political philosophy, is that once you get past a certain threshold of inequality, that rich people will start, the key premise is that economic holdings translate pretty straightforwardly into political power, so that you can translate your economic resources into political resources, and that inequalities in economic resources lead to inequalities in political resources. The wealthy will use their political resources to consolidate their advantages. They, in effect, disenfranchise the rest of the population. And even if we have a democracy in form, it's just it's just merely formal. It's just a husk of a democracy. What we really have is an oligarchy with the wealthy classes sort of dominating everything, right? And the key premise, the two key premises of the inequality road to serfdom argument that runs from, once you've gone past that threshold of inequality to oligarchy, is that economic inequality translates into political inequalities, and their people's political preferences are economically class-based.
I love these sorts of arguments. I mean, there's something fun about it, and so let me throw out another argument that's like sort of goes the complete opposite argument of that. This is an argument that we heard a lot in the 1970s, which was. Well, okay. Harry Hopkins, who was Franklin Roosevelt's key advisor, was said to have said, "Tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect." And in the 1970s, there was a lot of hand-wringing by pundits who said that this is the fundamental problem of democracy, is that 51% of the people can tax the other 49% into oblivion, and even if in the long run it wrecks the economy, in the short run it's just going to happen. And in fact, that extra 45, basically, like, things are going bad, but the worse things go, the more the lower income will want to tax the rich, kill the golden goose, and so forth. Then after that, there was some tax revolts, and then the conventional wisdom that was that you could never, ever, ever raise taxes, and now we're in a, now we're in a different one. So there's your argument. I mean, the argument that you're bashing the inequality argument is sort of the reverse of this other argument. And I guess they both of those arguments rely on, voters sort of, putting up with stuff, right? And so your argument that the ultimate version of the inequality road for serfdom is that Diebold makes all the voting machines, and so it doesn't matter how we vote, right? Right. And so then they get everything sort of set. It's really hard to evaluate arguments like that because of the finite number of elections, and the idea that, like, okay, this was a year that was a Democratic year. It would have been hard for a Republican to win. I mean, there's no doubt that something could have happened to help a Republican win the election, but. Nonetheless, the Republicans ran a moderate candidate, and they had various potential advantages, and they still lost. So because of this sort of swing, I suppose in a sense that's one of your potential arguments against the road to inequality thing. As long as you occasionally have swings, but I don't know. Like, I'm sort of babbling here, but like I think our experience. Okay, in the U.S., that we've had these swings, but then look at Japan, right? So I don't really know anything about Japan except one party has run it for a very long time, and I don't know if they're in the road to anything right now, but like, they have a democracy without power alternation, and once you don't have alternation, I think all sorts of horrible things can happen.
Yeah. I don't know anything about Japan, so I can't speak.
We can both talk about it. If we know nothing about it, that's perfect for the web, right?
Yeah. It's like a blogger's dream. But the point that I was like as you were saying earlier, that the rich and poor, the difference in their preferences in terms of at least party affiliation are really no different than they were more than half a century ago. And then in the I think this is in your book as well. You're right that there are a finite, a very small number of sort of national elections, but there's a lot more state level elections. And correct me if this is wrong, but it seems like the states that have higher levels of inequality tend to be more democratically dominated. And those tend to be the states where there's more support for higher levels of tax and redistribution. Isn't that right?
Almost. The correlation, the states with the most inequality, a lot of them are the ones with the most immigration, and they include Texas and Arizona as well as California and New York.
Okay.
But what we have found in the last 20 years, 25 years or so, is that the states, the more democratic states, the rich have gained the most in the richest states, which are the more democratic states. And the poor have actually gained the most in the poor states, which are the most Republican states. Now, that wasn't happening, like if you go 40 years ago to 20 years ago, that wasn't really happening. But the past 20 or 25 years, it has been occurring. That states like New York and Connecticut the rich have done very well in, under democratic governance. And states such as Mississippi, under Republican governance, the poor have done relatively well. They've improved their status, and not necessarily due to the state policies, but it certainly indicates there's no completely simple relationship. I wanted to throw a couple other things out there, and one is that I think that the values are important too, in even maybe especially in economics, and people. It is true that I do think that when some people have a lot of money, then maybe they will buy offices to some extent. I mean, the mayor of New York, it's hard to believe he would have been mayor if he hadn't spent so much money. And there's some Venn diagram of the intersection of people who are really rich and people who are willing to run and people who will make a credible politician. And you have William Randolph Hearst and Ross Perot and various people occupying parts of the Venn diagram, and maybe Bloomberg is sort of in that sweet spot in the middle. So the more super rich people you have, it seems the more likely that will happen. But
that's a good point.
That
at the same
said,
time, a Bill Clinton or Barack Obama has sort of political talent that no amount of money can buy, and so you can't. It doesn't matter how rich you are; you're not going to beat a guy like that in a race.
Well, yeah, I think apparently that's what's happened. So yeah, I think the party is a key thing. And the other thing I wanted to say about the differences is that the coalitions have changed. So when the gap between rich and poor is the same as it was in the post-World War II era, but it's different groups. So people have pointed out that the gap between rich and poor among whites is much lower than it used to be. And in some ways, I don't really know what to make of that. I having not lived in the immediate post-war period myself, it's hard for me to judge. I mean, my take on it is that the category white means something different than it used to. In that, back in the 1950s, maybe they weren't talking so much about white people. It was about different kinds of white people. Maybe if you were Polish American or Italian American, you weren't considered part of that category in a way that it might be now. Yeah. So to me, the fact that the Democrats are winning less of the lower income white vote, I don't take that so seriously, because I sort of think that of different groups as being not interchangeable, but different groups playing different roles in the society. It's not that income is the only factor, but as you were saying, it gives a sense of how people at different ends of the ladder are viewing policies.
Well, I think one of the a lot of times the thing that seems to me to be lurking under the surface of arguments about inequality and political power really are arguments about the distribution of political resources, and I just don't think it's the case that political resources, I think you're right, that you're more likely to run for office and be a viable candidate if you're independently wealthy, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. But values matter a lot. Just the preferences of voters makes a big difference. That's basically public policy to a fair degree tends to track the values and preferences of the median voter, and it's not necessarily the interests of the person with the median income. It's just the overall set of preferences.
I think that's especially true, like when you're talking about the general election of the two-party system. Now, when you talk about what policies are proposed, who knows? So, like if you look, like what are like some common occupations in the United States? Waiter or waitress, food preparation, hospital aides, teachers' aides, truckers, a bunch of things like that. Now, if there was a law that all these people had to be represented in Congress, I think we might have different policies.
Yes.
And especially if you talk about when you talk about someone like Obama and you say, well, he's a Democrat. If he's a Democrat with a lot of support from ethnic minorities, from lower income voters, some support from upper income voters too, as we can talk about, then but in many ways, he's also friendly to Wall Street, right? I mean, that's finance industry is a big contributor to the Democratic Party. Trial lawyers are big contributors, so forth. I think that's got to have some effect on what flavor of liberalism you're going to get.
Absolutely. Well, and that's part of the. Well, here let me finish like the point that I wanted to make, and we can move on to what the nature of the Democratic and Republican coalitions are, and how that's going to affect their policies. Because the point that you make about who proposes, who puts the policy alternatives on the table, is a big part of the question about the real distribution of political resources. And the people who have a huge amount of power over the alternatives that get offered are academia and the media, right? Like those are two of the biggest blocks of people with the ability to command to kind of take control of the intellectual and political agenda to tell us what our alternatives are. And that kind of power is a lot of power, but that's not something that that really lines up really, really well with being a millionaire.
Well, I think it not as well as I might like, I suppose. No, but I think it depends a lot on the issues. I mean, lobbyists, I have not studied this, but my impression is that lobbyists do have a lot of power, and if it's something that's going to be affecting the paper industry, then the paper industry has a lot of power, and so forth along the lines. I mean, we're not just talking about the National Rifle Association and ideological groups, but actually, industry groupings and labor groupings for that matter too. And that's gonna be a lot of it too, although that's, as I said, a little beyond. But I mean, there are two things I wanted to bring up, because I thought you would like them, and they're sort of related. One was something that James Flynn, he's the political scientist who studied IQ and the Flynn effect. He wrote this thing a few years ago talking about how meritocracy was impossible. And his argument was that meritocracy is not just that some people have more merit than others, that meritocracy has an ocracy attached to it. And that means people with more merit, whatever that means, run things.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do with your ocracy? You're going to take your ocracy and give some extra benefits to your kids. And so then you don't have meritocracy anymore. And so the very idea of it, and I do think a lot of, it sort of touches into what you're talking about, that I think when people talk about inequality, some of it is the idea that there's meritocracy and that creates inequality, or that there's a sort of new meritocracy of money which might be replacing some former thing. But I don't think these things are sort of inherently unstable, because whatever conditions would ever be created to create an ocracy are things that the people at the top of the ocracy are going to want to manipulate, because that's the whole point of being running stuff in the first place. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned some psychology research, is one of my favorite cognitive psychology findings is the illusion of control. Mm-hmm. And this is all aspects of life. People think they can do more than they can do. For example, the psychologists have taken people to Vegas-like settings and they have them roll the dice. And when they're trying to roll for a big number, they'll roll the dice really hard and throw them on the table. And when they're trying to get 1s and 2s and 3s, they'll roll the dice really softly. It's not to, disturb the numbers, right? And, well, a lot of this came out, I mean, my pet example of this is the election campaign. So what did Obama do right? What did McCain do wrong? Well, Obama's most brilliant strike was to be a Democrat in a year when the Republican was president and the economy was tanking. He did that well in the sense that, he focused on the economy and so forth, but still, there it is, right? And so when people talk about...
He ran the campaign and he needed to run to win.
Right, and I actually do think that journalists are a little better at this than they were 20 years ago when I first sort of started screaming about this stuff, that I think there was a lot of recognition that it's not that this was the pendulum swinging a little bit. This was not a good year for the Republicans. But I find it to me a good mnemonic to relate these kind of naivetes we have to the cognitive findings, and somehow it's maybe easier to accept that we all have this illusion. Maybe I have the illusion that I can control the public discourse by yapping.
Yeah, well, you can. Yeah, if you own the New York Times. No, but I think Jim Flint's point about meritocracy, just if I can comment on that for a second, is an outstanding point, which is one of the reasons that I really like super dynamist, fast-growing, creative destruction type societies, because it tends to unsettle power structures that allow people to sort of lock in privileges over generations. So one of the difficulties when it comes to equalizing opportunity is the fact that opportunities are so amazingly network dependent, that what opportunities you have depends on who you know, and it really does. And if you're just not in a position to become a part of an elite network, you'll never have a fraction of the influence that somebody who gets plugged into that network will have. That's one of the great things about blogging, for instance, is that it allows. Now I'm being self-serving, but I wouldn't be here talking to you if there wasn't blog software, because I was just a guy studying philosophy at some obscure school, and I wouldn't have had access to any of the networks that give you opportunities to talk to a broader public. And so new technologies, sort of fast economic growth, lots of innovation, I think really helps break up those ocracies. I don't think it's more likely to give you a meritocracy exactly, because the kind of ocracy you get just depends on what the incentives are in the sort of political economy. And I don't think the incentives are such that we're going to get the best and brightest. We're going to get the people who are, most motivated and to seek power, and who are good at self-deception, and who are good at deceiving other people, and are good at getting coalitional buy-in from overly romantic people who would like to see the power-hungry leader as a member of their moral tribe. That's the kind of people who win elections. But I'm just rambling now. But I think this point is important, that you can try to have rule by the best and brightest, but they'll try to consolidate their advantages like anybody who has power does. And so it's just best to have a system that just constantly is wiping out whatever the status quo system of advantage is.
Well, that's beyond my area of expertise, but I'll defer to you on that.
Let's talk about the 2008 election,
okay.
Andrew, since have taken too long getting there. So tell me, what are the big stories in the numbers in terms of changes in the electorate? So I think we just alluded to the fact that to a large extent, Obama's victory was kind of part of what you might call the political business cycle, or something like that. Which you're in a recession, there's an unpopular war. The candidate from the non-incumbent party is just going to have a hard time losing. But there were changes in the electorate that are worth pointing out. So what were what stuck out most to you?
Right. So the number one thing was that the changes were pretty small. After you take out the 5% national swing, and you take out the anomalous state of Hawaii, the states move pretty much uniformly. In fact, there wasn't, after you take out the national swing, the variation from 2004 to 2008 was not much different than the variation from 2000 to 2004, which was the closest we've ever seen to a replay election in at least in modern years. And some background that if you go back to earlier decades, like the 80s or the 50s, you did see more. You see things more shaken up. So if you look at Eisenhower's first election, Eisenhower's second, or Reagan's first election and Reagan's second, you actually see a bit more variation between states than you see going from Kerry to Obama. So I'd really emphasize that. Now, I think the biggest thing that people, what's the number one thing people notice is age. Mm-hmm. So in 2000, Gore did about as well among young voters as anybody else. I think actually, according to this, Gore got 49% among young voters, under 30 voters, so he slightly underperformed among young voters. In 2004, Kerry got about 55% of the under 30 vote. Mm-hmm. So he did better among the young. In 2008, Obama got like 67% of the under 30 vote. It was a landslide. Mm-hmm. Beyond landslide. Like 67% is, bigger than, any landslide in modern memory. So that's the hugest thing. And then beyond that, there were people, I have noticed stuff in the South, so in that some whites in the South were moving away from, Obama beat Kerry among whites, outperformed Kerry among whites by about 3 percentage points. But there are places in the South where he did worse among whites. So people have picked up on that as the most notable group to have gone the other direction. It's actually sort of hard to find a group, because it was so uniform, it's hard to find a group that supported Obama less than Kerry.
Yeah. And
then income, it's, I still have to try to understand this. As with Kerry and Gore, Obama did better among the poor than the rich. Mm-hmm. In fact, he did better among the poor than among the middle class. But if you believe the exit polls, the highest edge of income, the over 200,000 families, Obama actually did better than 50% in. Mm-hmm. So according to the exit polls, that was he actually he did okay there, whereas Kerry in the over 200,000 lost by a lot. Mm-hmm. So we used to say that if rich Americans were a state, they'd vote like Texas, and if poor Americans were a state, they'd vote like Massachusetts. After Obama, I'd say if rich Americans were a state, they'd vote like maybe Indiana or something like that,
Iowa.
Some intermediate state. maybe like Iowa. And if poor Americans were a state, they'd vote like more. They'd vote like some combination of Massachusetts and D.C. They're actually, because Obama just did so well among the lowest income group, because he did better among ethnic minorities. So it is a little different that as you go up to the highest income range, you're actually not seeing a continuing trend towards the Republicans. And I don't know the answer. Like how much of that is like, well, higher income people saying, well, here, let's take a chance. The mm-hmm. economy isn't going well anyway. Yeah. How much of it is the candidates? If it was Mitt Romney versus Hillary Clinton, maybe it would have been different. And so we'll have to see. I'm definitely curious what will happen in the congressional elections in 2 years with rich and poor. Yeah. That way, to see whether this is has all of America become like Connecticut, where rich people are now middle of the road? Or is this just a temporary phenomenon? I don't know.
Yeah, well, so it's too early to say whether this is a permanent ratchet, but there has been a trend over the last few elections of wealthier voters away from the Republicans toward the Democrats, and this seems to be like just an acceleration of that trend. Would that be?
Yeah, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see some pre-election poll data also. It's funny. There's some crappy stuff out there. Or crappy isn't the right word, but unverifiable stuff. So there was a survey floating around on the web talking about how the super rich vote, and it was something like It was like millionaires for McCain, billionaires for Obama. And so I looked it up, and it turned out it was done by the same person who did a study 4 years ago, and 4 years ago it was millionaires for Bush and billionaires for Kerry. And I tracked it down, and I think it's very hard to study the rich. It was done by some guy who has a consulting company. They actually do like market research or some sort of research about rich people, and it said we have a purposive sample of 400-something people. So purposive sample is when you don't have a random sample. Now, far be it from me to criticize them because I don't have a random sample of the rich. But I have to say I'm a little suspicious of a finding that, like I think if you know what you're looking for, then it seems like it's going to be pretty easy to find it. So that said, even for exit poll data, I don't know how much to believe it because that's just sort of one source. I'd like to get some more information on that.
In your book, you propose a hypothesis about why there is this divergence among wealthier voters. I mean, well, one thing I think that we haven't mentioned so far is that one of the big differences. So you've got wealthy voters tend to vote differently whether they live in rich states or poor states.
Right.
But also, there's a big difference between wealthy religious and wealthy non-religious voters. That's true as well, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, again, I haven't looked at 2008 on this, but yeah, in recent elections, well, first I should say the difference between religious and secular voters had jumped up in 1992 and has been pretty large since then. But indeed, the biggest difference between religious and seculars or church attenders and non-attenders has been among the rich, which is consistent with sort of social science theory, this idea that post-materialism, that as you're richer, you can afford to, sort of conceptually, you can afford to vote based on things like the environment or God, guns, and gays in a way that lower-income voters might not care about. My only anecdote about this is beyond whatever images you might have of environmentalists. On the other side, think of the Republican convention. So those are a bunch of upper-income Americans who were just, very happy to have a socially conservative vice presidential nominee. I don't think it was entirely because they thought they might win the election. I think they had a sincere feeling about that. So that, a little bit of anecdotal evidence. But yeah, the polls show that. But I haven't seen that particular breakdown in 2008, one way or the other.
Yeah, that's something that so the post-materialism thesis that comes from Ronald Inglehart at the University of Michigan, that's popped up in all sorts of different kinds of work that I've been doing when I was working on happiness. It comes up very, very strongly that you start to see a big differences in attitudes once people hit a certain threshold of income, and it's it's one of those things that's counterintuitive at first, but then it's not, which is that worrying about your economic welfare is something that you do when you need to worry about your economic welfare. But once you're above, $40,000-$50,000 a year in a position where you're really quite secure, in the grand scheme of things, then people just start worrying about, like, what does my life mean? What's it all about? What's the best thing for the planet? What's the best thing for social justice? And so a lot of, like, really big moral issues, the more they come to the forefront, it's partly because thinking about those things is a kind of luxury good. And to the extent to which the parties are polarized along those issues, if the Republican Party is a party about abortion and patriotism and a number of these others, so no gay marriage, and the Democratic Party is a party about sort of environmental purity and benevolence and justice, that to the extent that that's really the clash is because this clash is really a clash between the elites of two different high-income groups who have the luxury of not caring that much altogether about what, their level of economic security is so high that they prefer to think about the more airy, evaluative social issues.
I think there's some truth to that, and I mean, one thing we found. I mean, we didn't. I can't say we discovered because other people knew about this too.
Mm-hmm.
But we found in our book was that the differences between the parties on both economic issues and non-economic issues have increased in the past 30 or 40 years, and. It basically, the parties used to be apart on economic issues.
Mm-hmm.
When I say the parties now, I actually mean voters, people who support the Democrat or Republican for president. They used to be apart, but now they're much further apart on economic issues. And they used to be basically indistinguishable on social issues. So as late as Reagan's presidency, the average position on abortion among people who voted for Democrats was indistinguishable from the average among Republicans. And it's diverged a lot since then. So for whatever reason, and there's a lot of discussion on why that is, for whatever reason, both economic and maybe especially non-economic issues have become more of a dividing point. One thing you brought up, which I wanted to talk to you, I didn't get a chance to talk to you when I saw you a couple of months ago, was about happiness. And this was this finding that Republicans are happier than Democrats. And I was just fascinated by this idea that how different groups view progress. I have this quote in the book, my book from G.K. Chesterton, and he talks about based on his book from his book on Bernard Shaw. And Shaw was a socialist and a big believer in technological solutions. So that Shaw's view was if everybody listens to what Shaw does and follow his instructions, we'll have scientific socialism and everybody will be happy. And happy means having 2 chickens in your pot and so forth. Then maybe he might have been a vegetarian, I can't remember. But happiness means having enough to eat, being comfortable, the usual. Chesterton was having none of this. So he was an old-fashioned conservative Catholic of the sort of it's too bad about the Spanish Armada losing, that kind of thing. And his view was that, there's no happiness, material happiness is an illusion. You need spiritual happiness. And Chesterton was saying how really people were happier in the Middle Ages, and in a deep sense, they had fundamentally important lives. It's not about. He's a conservative, so he was saying, look, sure, you socialists, of course, you know how to make stuff work better, you know how to make everybody rich, but as conservative, I don't care about people being rich. I think that we should have traditional values, and people should stay on the land, and so forth. Now, then, somewhere along the way, there was a change, and you have basically conservatives saying, let's unleash the free market and stop whining. And you have liberals saying, well, look, sure, maybe GDP is higher in these countries than other countries, but what's GDP? GDP doesn't mean anything because if I blow up a house and then rebuild it, it increases the GDP, but like all these arguments, right? So
for one
GDP,
period, Andrew, one period.
I'm just telling you what I'm saying is this is what you hear people saying, right? And so I'm purposely trying to sort of give crappy arguments on both sides, but just to give a sense. So somehow there is some change. Now, this idea, maybe things are now in the other way. Like there may be, if you think of Obama somehow symbolizing technological optimism, and he's going to build a windmill in every corner, and John McCain is, traditional values and get off my lawn and that sort of thing. I don't know how much of this you want to take.
Get off my lawn, kid.
Well, here you see me this is what happens when I go beyond my area of competence. But I am actually interested in this idea of the discourse that on one level it seems to me that you have this idea of economic conservatism at least being associated with, for many years of my adulthood at least, being associated with a kind of optimism, a real change from the first half of the century. And then you do have survey findings finding that Republicans are happier than conservatives. Republicans are more happier than liberals and Democrats. And I don't really know what to make of this, but I sort of feel like there probably is some connection.
Well, I actually think that the main I don't know about the difference when it comes to a taste for progress, or these are things that you could test. You could test to see whether a certain level of sort of risk aversion correlated to the personality traits that tend to correlate strongly to conservatism and liberalism. But I don't know if that. But one of the things that I do know is true is that in the U.S., being religious has a pretty significant upward bump on people's happiness, and being religious and being a Republican, as you know, are pretty closely linked. So I actually think religious participation takes care of most of the relationship between being Republican and being a little bit happier. And I've actually gotten into a fairly involved dispute about that with Arthur Brooks, who's now the president of the American Enterprise Institute.
He was saying that even after controlling for religion, that this was still there, but I haven't looked into the data myself. Well, let me say one thing before this ends, because this relates sort of to get away from my speculation, which hopefully nobody was listening to, but back to our data, that we did some international comparisons, and one thing we found, again, these are things that are along the lines of seem surprising at first, but maybe not if you think about them more, is that the rich and poor in the U.S., rich and poor vote more differently in the U.S. than in most European countries. And at first that was a surprise to me, because my stereotype was that the U.S., the two parties are pretty similar. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum, or maybe the other way around. I can't keep it straight. But in Europe, there are these traditional conservative labor parties, that sort of thing. But then if you actually think about it, I talked with a colleague here who does comparative politics, that European politics is actually in economics much more consensual than the U.S. And the short version is that the welfare state is too popular to dismantle and too expensive to expand. And so they don't really fight very much about the economy, and this reflects itself in how people vote. Now, the other thing we found was that religious attenders and non-attenders differ as much or more in most European countries in how they vote than they do in the U.S. And the U.S. is special because there are so many strong religious attenders. It's such a part of politics. But just as a sort of predictor, it turns out that going to church or not going to church predicts how you vote. I can look, but I think it was a much stronger predictor actually in France and Germany than it was in the United States.
Yeah, to me that makes a lot of sense once you think about it, right? So those are countries that have gone a lot further along the path of secularization. So the people who are still religious in Sweden are going to be people with deeply conservative dispositions. And so you would expect sort of more fully secularized countries to have a tighter connection between conservatism and religious attendance. In a place where everybody goes to church anyway, the relationship should be pretty loose.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the party history. So in Ukraine, Russia, Romania, and the Czech Republic, there's no relation between religious attendance and how you vote.
Right.
But these parties, these are these post-communist parties. Yeah, but you talk about France and Germany and Sweden and Switzerland, and there's just a history of parties having this religious connection, and maybe it stays in there. Again, gives some perspective on what's happening in the United States, that some of the things that we see are more, maybe based on more global patterns.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But like, as we wind up, I wanted to say something and ask you something about the nature of sort of coalition politics. Because one of the things that one of the things I loved about your book is that it's just completely data driven, and that the theory that's in it is just drawn out from the data. It's an incredibly inductive book. Here's the data, and here's some general principles that might explain it. The thing that bothers me about actual most punditry is that it operates according to some kind of folk theories that are kind of unrelated to data. And one of the things that constantly drives me up a wall is that what seems clear to me, just looking at the way politics works and looking at the political science literature, is that a successful political party is a big coalition of a bunch of different interest groups. And that a winning coalition is going to cobble together lots of different people with lots of different, sometimes conflicting interests. And once your party actually gets into power, there's going to tend to be the structure of your coalition, the identity of the constituents of your coalition, just radically constrains what's possible for you in terms of any kind of reform. So if you are, if you're heavily invested in teachers' unions, say, it's going to be very difficult to make radical reforms in an area where one of your big constituencies is, just not very interested in making those reforms. Or if one of your big constituencies is religious conservatives, it's going to be hard to make reasonable concessions to slightly more moderate social policy. And so just the fact of having to cobble together these coalitions ends up giving you, really constraining what a political party can do. And when I see people with so much romantic hope about what Obama is going to be able to achieve, I think a lot of times they're missing out on the fact that he did an outstanding job of putting together a winning coalition, and that includes hedge fund managers. And it's not going to be what a lot of people hope for.
Well, I would say beyond, I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything you said there. I mean, beyond that, I would add two things that on most of the issues, voters tend to be between the Democratic and Republican parties, despite the fondest dreams of people on both sides. And so it's not, it's certainly not that there's this massive majority just waiting for somebody on your side in order to do what you want. But beyond that, I mean, beyond the constraints of coalitions, there are logical constraints. I mean, so on policy, there are budget constraints with foreign policy. There are constraints because there's people in other countries who might not do what you want. Then, even on social issues, so one of my favorite recent statistics some colleagues at Columbia showed me was that 75% of Americans support anti-discrimination laws making it illegal to discriminate against gays in housing and employment. And that's so widespread.
75%?
Yeah, and in fact, it's over 70% in 40 states. But only 20 states have such laws. Well, okay, so they want that people are supportive of that law, which gives you some insight as to why Obama mentioned anti-discrimination in his acceptance speech, by the way. And then, but half of Americans don't think gays should be allowed to be public school, elementary school teachers. Now that's that's of course one more piece of evidence that humans are not libertarians, but you know all about that since it's your area of study. That it's first it sounds sort of weird to an academic such as myself because I feel like maybe. I could certainly see someone supporting anti-discrimination laws and saying gays should be allowed to be teachers, and I could understand a pure anti-gay view as a coherent view, and I could understand someone saying, well, you shouldn't be allowed to someone saying, well, the government can. You can't make the government discriminate, but if individuals want to discriminate, that should be allowed. But a lot of people have this opposite view, which is that they think that it should be illegal. The government should pass a law making it illegal for private citizens to do something that actually they think the government should be allowed to do. And I think there's reason for this. I mean, anti-discrimination is a value that is strong in America, and as long as you don't think you're going to be discriminated against, it's like people like free press, but they tend to support prior restraint on the press because they don't think they're going to be libeling anybody, right? Yeah. But
and it could just simply be just that people aren't that interested in being it's not that they're not interested in being inconsistent, it's just people don't notice when they are.
Oh, right. They haven't formed a coherent policy. So that's why I was picking this as a vivid example of this general point. So what does it mean that Americans are moderate? Not necessarily that every American is like neutral Ned on everything, but rather that politicians, even Congress members and presidents, aren't completely coherent, but they have a bunch of logical constraints. So you can't really pass a law saying, that if they tried to pass a law saying it's illegal to discriminate, but the government can discriminate against gays, I mean, presumably that would be shot down by the courts. And you can't, the policy that everybody wants of cut taxes and raise spending, eventually, there's going to be problems with that one too. Mm-hmm. And similarly, like a lot of views. There are just a lot of constraints that voters don't realize because it's not their job to figure these things out. And really what they're picking is that, I prefer this guy to that guy, I prefer this party to that party. It's not going to mean 100% endorsement about what either candidate is standing for. I mean, my other favorite recent statistic is that the Democrats gained gained more in Congress from 2004 to 2008 than they did for the presidency. And the Democrats did better in congressional voting than Obama did. But, Obama's extremely popular, and, Democrats in Congress, probably the only thing less popular than Democrats in Congress are Republicans in Congress. But that's who they were running against, right? So, it's all relative when it comes to voting.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so the American public demands incoherence. Politicians try to give it to them, but without running themselves into trouble, which they would if they were literally to give the people what they wanted.
Yeah, I think there's, in addition to what you're saying
Andrew,
about interest
it's inspiring.
We try our best to tell how we see it.
I think we've run ourselves out of time. Thanks for coming on, Andrew. Your recent book is Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Why Americans Vote the Way They Do. I encourage everybody to pick it up. It's just rich with detail that will help you understand politics better. And thanks for a fascinating conversation, Andrew.
That was a pleasure.
All right, take care.
Okay, bye.